In June 2015, police were called to a small pink house outside Springfield, Missouri. For years, the woman who lived there, Dee Dee Blanchard, had been known as a devoted mother caring for a daughter with severe medical needs. Her daughter, Gypsy Rose, was often seen in a wheelchair. She had been through years of doctor visits, public fundraisers, and community support. To the people around them, their story looked like one of hardship, sacrifice, and survival. But when investigators entered the home, that story began to fall apart. Dee Dee was found dead, and Gypsy, the daughter many believed could not live without her mother's care, was missing. At first, it looked like a tragic crime and a possible abduction, but within days, police would uncover something far more complicated. Gypsy Rose had not been the helpless child the world believed her to be. For years, she had been living inside a life shaped by medical claims, public sympathy, and control. And the person at the center of that control was the one everyone had trusted most. Before Gypsy Rose Blanchard became the center of a national crime story, she was known through a very different image. A young woman in a wheelchair, often smiling beside her mother, appearing at charity events, hospitals, and community gatherings. To most people who met them, Gypsy was not a mystery. She was a child who had been through more than anyone her age should have to endure. Dee Dee Blanchard had built their life around that image. She told doctors, neighbors, charities, and support organizations that Gypsy suffered from serious medical conditions. Some were described as physical, some were neurological. Others were connected to her ability to eat, walk, or live without constant medical attention. The details could be complicated, but the message was always clear. Gypsy needed her mother to survive. After Hurricane Katrina, Dee Dee and Gypsy moved from Louisiana to Missouri. Dee Dee said many of Gypsy's medical records had been lost in the storm. That claim became important because it gave an explanation for missing documents, unclear histories, and medical details that were difficult to verify. In a new city, surrounded by people who wanted to help, the story continued almost without resistance. In Springfield, their public image grew stronger. The family received a wheelchair-accessible pink house through Habitat for Humanity. It was not just a place to live, it became a symbol. To the community, it represented survival after disaster, generosity after hardship, and a mother doing everything possible for her daughter. People did not look at that house and see a warning sign. They saw a family that deserved support. Dee Dee handled almost every part of Gypsy's life. She organized the appointments, she managed the medications, she spoke with doctors, volunteers, reporters, and organizations that offered help. She knew how to present the story in a way that made people listen, calm enough to seem credible, emotional enough to create sympathy, detailed enough to sound convincing. And because Gypsy appeared young, vulnerable, and dependent, few people pushed beyond the surface. For Gypsy, the role was already written before she was old enough to fully understand it. In public, she used the wheelchair. At appointments, Dee Dee often answered questions for her. At events, Gypsy became the face of a story everyone thought they understood. But away from the cameras, the charity events, and the hospital rooms, there were details that did not fit. Gypsy could walk. She was older than some people believed, and over time, she began to understand that parts of her own life had been shaped by claims that were not true. Still, from the outside, the story remained almost impossible to question. A mother asking for help for her sick daughter is not something people are trained to doubt. That is what made the case so difficult. The warning signs were hidden inside compassion. The control was hidden behind caregiving, and the truth was buried beneath a version of Gypsy's life that had been repeated for years. By the time people started asking the right questions, the story had already moved far beyond illness. It was becoming something much darker. Inside the pink house in Springfield, life was built around a routine that looked convincing from the outside. Gypsy was seen in the wheelchair during visits and public appearances, while Dee Dee guided the conversations around her. For anyone entering their world briefly, a volunteer, a neighbor, a reporter, the explanation seemed already complete. Gypsy was ill. Dee Dee was caring for her. There was nothing more to understand. But inside the home, that version of reality was beginning to crack. Gypsy later said she could walk when others were not watching. And over time, the difference between what she was told to show and what she knew about herself became impossible to ignore. Dee Dee moved through hospitals and support systems with confidence. She had learned how to describe symptoms, how to answer questions, and how to keep the focus on Gypsy's supposed medical needs. When parts of the story became difficult to confirm, the explanation was often complicated enough to end the conversation. Many people were not looking for deception. They were looking at a mother who appeared exhausted, organized, and deeply involved in her daughter's care. That made every doubt harder to voice. A doctor could question a detail. A neighbor could notice something strange. But the larger image remained intact. For Gypsy, growing older created a different kind of pressure. She was not simply playing a role for strangers. She was living inside it. The medical history, the public sympathy, the lowered expectations, all of it shaped how people treated her and how little control she had over her own future. As she became more aware, she started searching for contact beyond Dee Dee's reach. The internet gave her something she rarely had in real life, a space where she could speak without her mother beside her. It did not give her freedom, but it gave her a glimpse of another life. That glimpse mattered, because once Gypsy saw herself outside the version Dee Dee had created, the house began to feel smaller. The wheelchair was no longer just an object people associated with illness. It had become part of a performance she no longer believed in. Still, the outside world was not prepared to see Dee Dee as the source of danger. For years, she had been accepted as the responsible parent, the medical advocate, the woman holding everything together. So when Gypsy began looking for a way out, she was not only trying to leave home, she was trying to prove that the life everyone believed in had never been real. As Gypsy became more aware of the life she was living, the internet became one of the only places where she could exist outside of Dee Dee's version of her. Online, she was not just the sick daughter in the wheelchair. She could choose what to say. She could speak without Dee Dee answering first. She could imagine a future that did not begin and end inside the pink house. That is how she eventually came into contact with Nicholas Godejohn. At first, the relationship existed mostly in private messages, hidden from the world Dee Dee controlled. For Gypsy, it felt like someone was finally seeing her as more than a patient, more than a charity story, more than the role she had been forced to play. The relationship developed in a world Dee Dee could not fully monitor. Gypsy and Nicholas spoke about love, escape, and a life together beyond Missouri. But the more serious the connection became, the more dangerous the situation inside the house began to feel. Gypsy had tried to create distance before. She had reached for independence in small ways, but each attempt seemed to pull her back into the same reality. Dee Dee still controlled the home, the medical appointments, the documents, and the way the outside world understood Gypsy. To leave, Gypsy believed she needed more than courage. She needed someone who would help her cross a line she could not cross alone. Nicholas became that person. Their messages grew darker as the idea of escape changed into something more serious. It was no longer only about leaving the house. It became about removing the person Gypsy believed would never let her go. This is where the case becomes difficult to categorize. Gypsy had been manipulated, isolated, and medically misrepresented for years. But the plan that formed between her and Nicholas was not simply an act of running away. It was a decision that would lead to irreversible consequences. And by the time they moved from fantasy into action, the story had already passed the point where anyone could undo it quietly. In June 2015, Nicholas traveled to Missouri. What happened next would end Dee Dee Blanchard's life and expose the truth that had been hidden around Gypsy for years. For the first time, the world would see that the sick girl in the wheelchair had not been the full story. But the way that truth came out made everything more complicated. Because Gypsy was not found as a missing victim in need of rescue. She was found as part of a criminal investigation. And as police began connecting the messages, the travel, and the events inside the house, the question became harder to answer. Was Gypsy Rose finally escaping abuse? Or had she become part of something she could never take back? The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a neighbor knocking on the door. It appeared online. A disturbing post was published from the Facebook account Dee Dee and Gypsy shared, written in a way that immediately alarmed people who knew them. Friends began calling, messages went unanswered, and soon, police were sent to the house in Springfield. For officers entering the home, the first assumption was that 2 victims might be involved. Dee Dee was found dead, and Gypsy, the daughter believed to be medically fragile and dependent on constant care, was nowhere inside the house. At first, the search focused on finding Gypsy alive. People feared she had been taken or that she was in danger without the medical care everyone believed she needed. But investigators quickly began following the digital trail. The Facebook activity, the messages, and the connection to Nicholas Godejohn pointed away from a random attack. The case moved from Missouri to Wisconsin, where police found Gypsy and Nicholas together. Then came the detail that changed how the entire story was understood. Gypsy was not in a wheelchair, she could walk. That single fact transformed the investigation. The public had known Gypsy as a severely ill young woman who needed her mother for everything. Now, police were looking at someone who had helped plan her mother's death, but who had also lived for years inside a false medical narrative. The case no longer fit into a simple category. It was not just a murder investigation. It was also the collapse of an identity that had been built in front of doctors, charities, neighbors, and the media. And as investigators began to separate fact from performance, the question changed. Not only what happened to Dee Dee Blanchard, but what had been happening to Gypsy Rose for years. Once Gypsy and Nicholas were arrested, the case began moving in a direction few people expected. At first, the public reaction was shock. For years, Gypsy had been seen as a seriously ill young woman who needed constant care. Now she was appearing in court, walking on her own, and speaking about a life that looked very different from the one people had been shown. The more investigators learned, the more the old story unraveled. Medical records, family history, interviews, and witness accounts began to reveal a pattern that had been hidden in plain sight. Gypsy had been presented as having illnesses that evidence later showed she did not have. She had been taken to doctors, given treatments, and kept inside a medical identity that shaped almost every part of her childhood and adulthood. But the legal system still had to deal with what happened to Dee Dee. Abuse could explain the background, it could explain the desperation, but it did not erase the crime. That is what made the case so difficult for the public to process. Gypsy was not only a victim, and she was not only a defendant, she was both things at the same time. In 2016, Gypsy Rose Blanchard pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Nicholas Godejohn was later convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The difference in their sentences reflected how differently the court viewed their roles. For Gypsy, the abuse she had endured became a central part of the case. For Nicholas, the court focused on the act itself and his involvement in carrying it out. By the end, the public knew the truth about the wheelchair, the illnesses, and the years of deception. But the truth did not make the story simple. It only made it harder to judge. What makes the Gypsy Rose Blanchard case so difficult is not that the facts are unclear. It is that the facts lead to a place most people do not know how to judge. For years, Gypsy lived inside a version of herself created by someone else. Her illnesses, her limitations, even the way the world looked at her, all of it had been shaped before she was old enough to question it. But the moment she tried to escape that life, the story crossed into something that could never be undone. A life was taken, and the truth that followed came at the highest possible cost. That is why this case still unsettles people, because it is not only about deception, and it is not only about violence. It is about the danger of a lie becoming so accepted that almost no one thinks to challenge it. Doctors missed warning signs, neighbors trusted what they were shown, charities believed they were helping a child in need. And by the time the full reality came into focus, it was already tied to a criminal case. That leaves one question with no simple answer. When a victim becomes part of a crime, how do we decide where sympathy ends and responsibility begins? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And tell us, which case should we cover next? If you enjoyed this video and want to see more cases like this in the future, let us know in the comments, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to turn on the bell for more documentaries.